The new teacher's arrival. The morning mist still clung to the windows of Fairhill High School when Alara Jennings stepped out of her dusty Ford and pulled her bag close to her chest. It was her first day as the new art teacher, a first day in a new town, a new school, a new chapter of her life. Alara drew a long breath and stepped towards the building, brushing a strand of chestnut hair out of her eyes. What she didn't know was that inside those walls, a group of students was already plotting to humiliate her. Alara was the sort of teacher every school needed, quiet but confident, passionate about nurturing creativity. Her voice was soft but commanding, the kind that drew students closer rather than shouted them down. At 29, she had learned to mask her trauma with a warm smile and a faint shimmer of resilience in her amber eyes. The faint scar across her left palm, a relic of an old accident, was the only hint of a darker story buried deep inside. Fairhill High was a decent school by reputation, but it had its cracks. The corridors weren't as well policed as the staff liked to claim, and certain students acted as if rules didn't apply to them. Among those were 3 seniors, Kyle, Mason, and Julia. Together, they were the unofficial tyrants of the school. Kyle was tall, broad-shouldered, and possessed a sneer that could make a younger kid wilt. Mason, sharp-faced and cunning, acted as the brains. Julia, with a mask of beauty concealing a mean streak, was the sharp tongue and gossip-monger. As Alara walked into her first class, a group of sophomores and juniors, she felt the hum of curiosity. Students glanced up from their phones, whispering to each other. A handful smiled shyly, but at the back, the trio exchanged a glance and smirked. The lesson started well. Alara introduced herself, talked about the power of expressing feelings through color and form. The students responded, some openly engaged, others wary. But as soon as she turned to write an assignment on the board, a paper ball clipped her shoulder and fell to the floor. The room erupted in muffled laughter. Alara picked up the paper slowly, smoothed it out, and read aloud the words scrawled across it. "Go back to whatever hole you came from, art freak." The voice didn't quiver, though her hand shook slightly as she folded the paper and placed it calmly in the waste bin. The silence that followed felt charged, almost electric. "Thank you for sharing your thoughts," she said quietly, brushing dust from her blouse. "If that's the best you can do with words, you have a long way to go as an artist." A few students snickered, and one shy boy in the second row smiled approvingly. But at the back, Kyle exchanged a glance with Mason and Julia. Their expressions promised this wasn't over. Days passed. Alara tried to win the trust of her students, and she succeeded mostly. The quieter kids began to stay after class too, ask questions, and a few others started submitting surprisingly heartfelt sketches. But the trio, they ramped up their attacks. They bumped into her in the corridors. They drew mocking cartoons of her and pasted them on the bathroom walls. They called her Miss Frompen Art, which ensnared whispers that floated down the corridors. Alara felt every sting, every slight, but refused to break, not in front of them. Then came the day that would forever change Fairhill High. It was a Tuesday morning when Alara walked into her classroom and felt the atmosphere shift. The trio was whispering in the corner. The room felt too quiet, too charged. As she laid down her bag and started unpacking paints and canvases for the lesson, it happened. Kyle surged from his desk, and before she could react, he grabbed a fistful of her blouse and ripped it violently down the side. The sound of tearing fabric felt like a gunshot. Alara gasped, and a wave of cold air and terror crashed over her. The room erupted into chaos. Some students yelled in shock, others froze. Alara stood in the center, shaking, a long tear exposing her side. Humiliation surged to the surface, burning her throat and blinding her for a second. Then, with a trembling hand, she tapped the tiny camera clipped to her lapel. The camera she had started wearing after the bullying began. The camera she had bought herself online because she refused to let herself be silenced, or dispelled. It was still recording, with one shaking hand pressed to the torn fabric. Alara backed towards her desk and pressed a small button on the device. Suddenly, the sound of Kyle's voice, mocking, sneering, rang out from a tiny speaker she kept connected for review. The room fell deathly silent as Kyle's voice boomed across the room. "Go on, art freak. Let's see you smile. Now." Then came Julia's voice, dripping with contempt. "Maybe if you weren't so ugly, you wouldn't be teaching this dump." And Mason, "Bet she cries herself to sleep every night." Someone had to teach her a lesson. The color drained from their faces. Suddenly, every phone in the room was pointed towards the trio. Suddenly, every witness had proof. The silence that followed felt like an eternity. Alara drew herself to her full height, brushing hair from her tear-streaked face. The camera winked, its recording light like a beacon of truth. "Thank you for teaching me a lesson," she said quietly, voice shaking but strong. "Because the lesson you just learned is worth far more than mine ever could be." Then she walked out of the room, torn shirt pressed tight to her side, shaking with adrenaline. The corridors felt like a long, dark tunnel. The whispers bubbled, like rising steam dot, but as she pushed the staff room door open and sank down onto a chair, Alara felt something shift deep within. The sound of the trio's cruelty, captured clearly, would soon expose every smirk, every slur, every sneer. Longer would she bear this alone? What Alara didn't know was that the recording wouldn't just expose 3 bullies. It would crack open a scandal buried deep in the heart of Fairhill High, and the fallout would shatter lives, expose long-held secrets, and test the limits of survival. For now, she pressed the camera closer to her chest and promised herself one thing: this was only the beginning. The fallout and the secrets. Fairhill High tried to hide Alara, didn't remember how long she sat in the staff room after the attack. It felt like hours. The torn edges of her shirt felt like a brand burning into her skin, and every sound in the hallway felt too sharp, too close. Yet in that silence, something sparked inside her, a flame she hadn't felt in years. This was not just about a torn shirt anymore. This was about every student, every teacher, every person silenced by cruelty. Through the staff room door, muffled voices rose and fell. The sound of her recording had circulated within minutes. A handful of students had pulled out their phones, capturing snippets of the trio mocking her. The moment Kyle ripped the shirt, the collective gasp of the class. The recording Alara had saved became wildfire, and the wildfire refused to be extinguished. By the next morning, Fairhill High felt like a different place. The corridors buzzed with tension. Whispers followed Alara as she walked to her classroom, some sympathetic, some wary, and some outright fearful. But for the first time in weeks, no one bumped into her intentionally. No one sneered when she passed. The trio, Kyle, Mason, and Julia, were nowhere to be seen. Rumor had it they were pulled out of first period by the principal, and the sound of Kyle yelling and a door slamming had been the gossip of the morning. Alara sank down at her desk and watched as the students filtered in, quieter and more subdued than usual. The boy in the second row, the shy one who smiled faintly the first day, gave her a hopeful glance. Alara smiled softly and nodded. It felt like the first breath of a long-awaited spring. Then came a sharp knock at the door. It was the principal. Margaret Kane, a tall, sharp-eyed woman with graying hair pulled into a nonsense bun. To the students, she was an imposing figure. To Alara, she felt like a beacon of support. "Miss Jennings," the principal said quietly, "a word, if you don't mind." Alara rose and followed her into the hallway. The air felt crisp, charged. With anticipation, Mrs. Kane led her to the office, where 3 pale-faced teenagers, Kyle, Julia, and Mason, sat slumped in plastic chairs. Their bravado had drained away. They refused to make eye contact. Mrs. Kane spoke first, voice like steel. "Miss Jennings, we've reviewed the recording. We've reviewed witness statements. What happened to you is unacceptable." She drew a slow breath, brushing a hand down the edge of her crisp suit. "These 3 students will be suspended immediately, and expulsion proceedings have already begun." Alara felt a sting behind her eyes. Not for herself, but for the tragedy of wasted potential she now witnessed. Kyle, the boy who acted like a beast, suddenly looked like a frightened child. Julia, for all her sharp tongue, sank into herself, brushing away alone, shaking tear. Mason refused to move, jaw clenched like a man about to break. Then came the words Alara hadn't expected. "Miss Jennings," the principal said softly, "you have every right to press charges. We will support you fully. Whatever you decide, this school will stand by you." Alara stood there for a long moment. The sound of her heart beating felt like a drum in the silence. Whatever came next, she needed to be certain it was worth it. Back in her quiet classroom later that afternoon, Alara sank into her chair and pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. Not for herself, but for them. Not to justify their cruelty, but to ask herself why. Why had 3 young people felt the need to destroy, humiliate, and silence someone? What broken pieces of their own stories had led to this moment? As much as she wanted to unleash her anger, another voice surfaced. One that spoke of transformation, of making sure this cycle ended. She watched the 3 students walk down the hallway as security officers flanked them. The harsh sting of betrayal bubbled in her chest, but she refused to give in to it. That evening, Alara called the principal herself. "I don't want to press charges for assault," she said quietly, brushing a hand across the torn fabric of the shirt still hanging over the back of her chair. "But I do want accountability. I want counseling for those students. I want to meet with their families. And I want an opportunity to speak openly with them about the damage their words and their hands can do. Not because they deserve mercy, but because this can't be where their stories end." There was a long silence on the other end, followed by a slow, measured reply. "That's an unexpected request, Miss Jennings. You understand it's highly irregular." "I do, but if this is going to mean anything, it has to be about more than expulsion. Let it be about change." The days that followed felt like a whirlwind. The recording circulated beyond Fairhill High. Social media picked it up. The story of the shy new teacher whose shirt was torn apart, and the secret camera that captured it all, became a rallying point for teachers and students across the state. Alara received emails of support from strangers and fellow teachers alike. Meanwhile, Kyle, Julia, and Mason weren't to be seen in the corridors for weeks. Whispers circulated that their families had pulled them out of the area. Others said therapy had been ordered by the court. Whatever the case, Alara refused to harbor hate, and yet, deep down, she knew this was only the surface. What had bubbled forth that morning was part of a much darker current. Someone had fueled their cruelty. Someone had molded their aggression. Long ago, as she peeled away the threads of the story, Alara discovered that the trio weren't the only broken pieces in this puzzle. An anonymous letter landed in her staffroom mailbox one morning, typed and unsigned. "It's not just the students. Look closer. Fairhill has secrets it doesn't want you to find." Her heart pounded as she read the words, brushing a finger across the crisp paper. What had started as an attack was becoming something darker, a thread that would lead deep into the heart of the school itself. A secret that would drag her into a storm she hadn't anticipated, a storm that would test every piece of strength she possessed. And as Alara sank into her chair, rereading the words until the room blurred, one thing became certain: the story had only just begun. The hidden scandal. Alara fights against a dark conspiracy. The anonymous letter shook Alara more than she cared to admit. Its crisp, impersonal font felt like a warning that Fairhill High was more than a place for teenage mischief and bullying. It was a breeding ground for a deeper, darker rot, one that no one talked about openly. For a week, Alara kept it tucked inside a book, afraid to speak of it, afraid even to acknowledge its weight. But every night, she pulled it out and read it under the lamp in her tiny, cramped apartment. "It's not just the students. Look closer. Fairhill has secrets it doesn't want you to find." She thought about Kyle, Julia, and Mason, about how quickly their aggression surfaced, how deep their cruelty ran. Were they acting out of their own pain? Or were their outbursts signs of something much darker lurking behind the school's walls? Whatever the answer, Alara refused to stand by and do nothing. A few days later, she found herself in the office of Margaret Kane, the veteran principal of Fairhill High. The older woman sank into the leather chair, brushing her graying hair from her temples. "I've been thinking about what you said," Mrs. Kane confessed quietly, brushing a hand down a stack of papers. "About making sure this doesn't end with expulsion and silence." Alara met her gaze. "Then we have to ask harder questions. Not just about those 3 students, but about this place. Someone gave me a warning, an anonymous note. It said Fairhill has secrets, and those secrets shape the cruelty we witnessed. What if Kyle, Julia, and Mason weren't just bad kids? What if they learned this behavior from somewhere?" The principal sank deeper into the chair, brushing the edge of the papers. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "There have been incidents, cases I've tried to bury, not because I wanted to, Alara, but because of pressure from higher up. Cases of aggression, cases of staff misconduct, cases of intimidation." Alara felt her breath hitch. "You're telling me this has happened before?" Mrs. Kane nodded slowly. "More times than I can count." That evening, Alara started to piece together the threads. From the staff room, she pulled old yearbooks and accident reports buried deep in the archives. What she found shook her to the core. 3 years ago, a student named Marcus Lane was suspended for violence against staff, except he claimed he acted in self. The teacher he accused was quietly forced into early retirement. 6 years ago, another teacher, Hannah Carter, left mid-year after submitting a complaint about a senior teacher named Mark Davies, a complaint that mysteriously disappeared from the school records. More instances surfaced. An aggressive student transferred. A quiet teacher suddenly resigned. A staff room that treated bullying as one-time incidents or student misbehavior was actually covering a larger systemic decade. At each piece felt like a knife twisting in Ilara's chest. This wasn't just about 3 students ripping a shirt. This was about a culture that had refused to protect the vulnerable, about a school that protected its reputation over its people. Then came the night that changed everything. Ilara had been working late in her classroom, surrounded by files and old photographs, when a sound at the door made her look up sharply. A figure emerged from the shadows. It was Julia. The girl's sharp, confident demeanor was gone. Instead, a frightened teenager stood shaking in the doorway, brushing hair out of red-rimmed eyes. I didn't mean. Julia choked out the words. That day, I didn't mean any of it. Ilara rose slowly. Why are you here, Julia? The girl sank down at one of the desks, brushing at a fresh bruise on her forearm. He doesn't just hurt people in school, Miss Jennings, Julia said hoarsely. My stepfather is on the school board. Kyle and Mason. They're like my brothers. We all came from the same place. The same anger, the same house, the same silence. The words shook Ilara to the core. That's why you bullied me. Julia shrugged, brushing at the tears streaking down her cheeks. Better to be the monster than the one getting hurt. At least that's what we learned. The room felt charged with the weight of a lifetime of cruelty passed down from parent to child, teacher to student. Ilara sank down beside Julia, brushing a hand across the girl's shaking fingers. We can break this cycle, Julia. All of us. The girl sank into silence, and in that silence, Ilara felt the threads of a long-hidden truth finally beginning to weave themselves together. Over the next few weeks, Ilara worked with Principal Kane, gathering evidence and building a case. Together, they spoke to students and staff. They unearthed buried complaints. They worked quietly, knowing that one misstep could destroy everything. Then came the night the story surfaced, and Fair Hill High School shook. An article appeared, online titled, The Secret Culture of Fear and Abuse at Fair Hill High. It exposed years of cover-ups, the staff dismissals, the quiet retirements, the bullying that came from broken homes and corrupt institutions. The link between a school board member, Julia's stepfather, and a system that silenced victims. The media descended. The school became a lightning rod for questions about accountability and systemic abuse. The board announced a full investigation. The students, teachers, and families spoke openly for the first time in years. Through it all, Ilara felt herself shift from frightened newcomer to beacon of change. What had started as an attack meant to break her had uncovered a tangled web that refused to stay buried. But as the sound of protest rose outside Fair Hill High and the camera crews descended, Ilara felt a deep ache in her chest. The surface was exposed, but the roots of this cruelty sank deep, too deep for one person to eradicate. Then came a quiet message, another handwritten note pressed into the crack of her office door. Thank you for standing when others fell. Though truth can only heal when it is brought to light. Ilara sank down at her desk, brushing a hand across the words. Somehow, she felt the sting of betrayal and the sting of belonging intertwine. The storm had arrived. The threads were pulled. The secrets exposed. Yet, deep down, Ilara knew that the biggest challenge was still to come. To create a space where broken children could heal, where cruelty could end, where a new chapter could be written for every person who had been silenced for too long. But as the bells rang and the corridors shook with the sound of a new dawn rising, one thing was certain. This was only the turning point. The real reckoning was yet to come. The final confrontation when Ilara challenges the heart of the beasts. The weeks following the article felt like living inside a whirlwind. Fair Hill High became a pressure cooker of tense meetings, hastily called assemblies, and fearful whispers that shimmered down corridors like sparks. Ilara felt it every morning when she walked through the doors. The air itself was charged with anticipation. The media coverage didn't just expose the surface. tensions between students and teachers. It peeled back long-buried secrets that administrators had tried desperately to bury. The school board announced an official investigation. New staff came in to review files that had long been ignored. The police conducted interviews. Fair Hill High was no longer a quiet, orderly institution. It was an open book, and every page was being read aloud. Through it all, Elara refused to stand down. The 3 students, Kyle, Julia, and Mason, weren't just suspended anymore. They were given the option of counseling, rehabilitation, and restorative meetings. Julia chose to stay and seek help. Mason promised to change, but Kyle refused, lashing out one final time before disappearing from the corridors. Altogether, then came the biggest shock. It happened on a Tuesday morning. Elara was in her classroom when the door creaked open, and in walked Julia, shaking like a frightened bird. In her hand, a manila envelope. In her eyes, a terror and desperation that no teenager should carry. "Miss Jennings," she said hoarsely, brushing hair from a purpling bruise on her temple. I brought this for you. You said someone needed to stand up." Elara sank down beside her and opened the envelope slowly. Inside was a stack of photographs and documents, evidence, proof, photos of students with bruises, copies of complaints filed and buried, financial records that linked a certain name to a long-running scheme of intimidation and cover-ups. That name belonged to Gregory Halston, the chairman of Fair Hill High's school board, Julia's stepfather. Elara felt her breath falter. Suddenly, every piece clicked into place. The cruelty hadn't been random. The aggression hadn't been just teenage bullying. It was learned behavior, molded by a man with too much power and too little conscience. That afternoon, Elara walked into the heart of the beast, the school board meeting room. The room felt cold, a long oval table lined with the senior staff and a few tense faces. At the head of the table sat Gregory Halston, a tall, imposing man with sharp features and a voice that dripped authority. He smiled when he saw her, a thin, humorless smile. "Miss Jennings," he drawled, brushing a hand down a stack of papers. "To what do we owe this unexpected visit?" Elara didn't flinch, not anymore. She placed the envelope down and pulled out a single photo, holding it high. "To this," she said, voice shaking, but strong. "To every student and teacher silenced in the corridors of Fair Hill High. To every family torn apart. To every person you tried to bury." The room erupted in tension. Halston surged to his feet. "That's enough. Miss Jennings, whatever fairy tale you're peddling here, it ends now. You're in over your head." "Am I?" Elara asked sharply, tossing the rest of the documents down like a gauntlet. "This ends when every one of these stories is brought to light. You can try to silence a teacher, Mr. Halston, but you can't silence a whole generation." A long silence followed. The room felt like it was holding its breath. The sound of a phone clicking a photo, the shuffle of a chair, the low hum of the air conditioning. Suddenly, Elara felt herself shaking, yet rooted to the spot. Somehow, she knew this was the line in the sand. What came next was chaos. Halston roared, barking threats as staff surged to their feet. Julia, shaking but resolute, stepped into the room and spoke aloud for the first time. "Tell them what you did, Gregory, to Kyle, to Mason, to me, to all of us." Gasps erupted. The room descended into a storm of voices and accusations. The evidence circulated like wildfire. By the end of the hour, the man who had run Fair Hill High like his personal kingdom was stripped of power and placed under investigation. Through it all, Elara stood at the heart of the storm, not as a passive witness anymore, not as a frightened teacher torn between silence and action, but as a witness to a long overdue reckoning. The days that followed felt like a slow exhale. The media descended upon Fair Hill High, tearing apart every corner until the truth came crawling out of the woodwork. The school announced reforms, a counseling program for students and staff, and a review of every buried complaint. Julia, with a shy, broken voice, spoke openly to her classmates about breaking the cycle of cruelty. Mason offered an apology to Elara and promised to seek help for the anger that bubbled within him. Even Kyle, pulled from the school and placed into a therapy program, quietly sent a handwritten note. "I'm sorry, Miss Jennings. You didn't deserve what we gave you. You gave us a chance when no one else would. I don't know how to fix it, but I'll try." Through the sting and the scars, Elara felt something shift within herself too. The torn shirt that had marked the worst moment of her career became a symbol of strength, a reminder that silence only serves the oppressor. As she stood in the courtyard one crisp morning, brushing a hand down the smooth surface of the school sign, Alara felt a quiet peace settle over her. The cost had been high, the pain deep, but the lesson was worth every scar. The darkest secrets can only thrive in silence. The moment we speak, we reclaim ourselves, and we reclaim the world. Fair Hill High would never be the same, nor would Alara Jennings. And deep down, she promised herself this. The final chapter of this story would belong to every person who refused to be silenced. The aftermath, healing, resistance, and a new beginning. The days that followed the revelations felt like trying to walk across a field littered with broken glass. The sting was everywhere, in the silence that fell when teachers passed one another in the corridors, in the wary glances exchanged by students, and in the absence of the man who had ruled Fair Hill High like a tyrant for too long. With Gregory Holston gone and under investigation, the school became a space in transition. An interim principal was appointed, a veteran educator named Alan Reese, a man with a quiet voice and deep lines around his eyes. He called for meetings, spoke openly with staff, and, most critically, announced that Fair Hill High would be partnering with a crisis counselor and external mediators to support students and teachers alike. Through it all, Alara felt herself straddling a strange space between vulnerability and strength. The torn shirts she had worn the day of the attack now hung framed in the staff room as a reminder, not of the assault itself, but of the stand she had taken. New staff members arrived, new policies were drafted, the old threads of cruelty and silence began to unravel. Meanwhile, Kyle, Julia, and Mason faced their own reckonings. Julia returned to school, quieter, thinner, but determined. At first, students watched her warily, whispers trailing in her wake, yet she refused to hide. In the counselor's office, in meetings with Alara and the interim principal, she spoke openly about the terror she had lived with for years, about Gregory Holston, about a stepfather who molded cruelty in others because cruelty was the only language he spoke. Mason came to her sullen and ashamed. The boy with the sharp smile sank down in the counselor's office and, for the first time in his life, spoke openly about his anger. He spoke about a father in prison and a mother too exhausted to protect him. He spoke about how cruelty felt like belonging until he discovered it came at too steep a price. Kyle, however, refused to return to Fair Hill High. The boy who had torn a teacher's shirt now sat in a juvenile counseling program, grappling with the sting of betrayal and guilt. Yet, a quiet shift emerged, a handwritten note delivered to Alara one morning. Sorry, not for getting caught, not for being punished, but for hurting someone who tried to teach when no one tried to teach us. Kyle, through it all, Alara refused to give in to despair. What started as a brutal moment in a quiet classroom became an ember for something brighter, a beacon for change. Slowly, Fair Hill High began to piece itself together. A student-led campaign called Break the Silence emerged, starting with a poster in the corridors: "Your voice can save a life. Speak. Listen. Stand together." Workshops were held in the library. Group meetings reshaped old cliques into new alliances. The shy boy in the second row, the one who had smiled approvingly at Alara months ago, became one of the campaign's leaders, sharing openly about his own struggles with bullying. One afternoon, after a staff meeting, Alara sank down at her desk and felt the sting of a quiet but profound victory. The students weren't enemies anymore. They weren't weapons molded by a corrupt system. They were wounded, hopeful threads that, if tended with care, could be woven into something new. Then came the night Alara hadn't anticipated. A text from Julia lit up her phone long after midnight. "Miss Jennings, can we talk? There's something you need to know." The next morning, in the still sunlit staff room, Julia pulled out a thin manila envelope. Alara sank down across from her as the younger girl spoke. "It didn't end with Gregory," Julia confessed, voice shaking. "He had friends, people higher up, people still in the school. They knew. They ignored it. They silenced it. Miss Jennings, if you thought this was the end, it's only the beginning." Alara felt herself go cold. The threads she had pulled weren't only connected to Gregory Holston, they were knotted deep within the very structure of the school itself. What started as an attack in a quiet classroom had become an unstoppable force, an unstoppable wave rising toward the heart of Fair Hill High. That evening, as Alara stood at the window and watched the sun sink low over the courtyard, she felt a strange mixture of emotions: fear, anger, but also a profound sense of belonging. Somehow, she knew she wouldn't walk this path alone anymore. Not when so many had found their voice, through every whisper and every glance. One thing became certain: Fair Hill High was no longer a place where secrets could survive. Not anymore. Not with Elara Jennings and her students standing strong. Not with a witness in every room and a voice rising from every corner. The storm was only gathering strength, and Elara felt herself rise to meet it. The final reckoning, healing, justice, and a new dawn for days. The weight of Julia's revelation pressed down upon Elara like a storm building on the horizon. Gregory Holt had been the surface of the beast, a figurehead for cruelty, but Julia had peeled back the veneer and exposed a darker rot within the walls of Fair Hill High. A network of silence and complicity reaching higher and deeper than any had guessed. Elara refused to walk this path alone. Together with interim Principal Alan Reese, Julia, and Mason, she started compiling evidence. Old files, buried complaints, and witness statements came pouring forth. Students came out of the woodwork, and retired teachers called Elara in the dead of night, with stories long buried. Each piece felt like a spark, igniting a blaze that refused to be extinguished. Then came the morning when it all broke open. A shaking hand, Elara walked into the packed Fair Hill High auditorium, flanked by Julia and Mason. The room was packed with staff, students, and press. An independent review panel had been appointed. The air crackled with tension. Elara stepped up to the microphone and spoke slowly, voice shaking with emotion and conviction. "Today is about truth," she said. "About years of silence. About cruelty masked as discipline and intimidation, disguised as order. Today Fair Hill High can either continue down its old path, or it can stand for something new." With that, she pressed a remote in her hand, and a slideshow projected across the screen. Documents, photographs, and witness statements. The room sank into silence as the threads of a long-buried scandal emerged. The names of staff complicit in silencing complaints, the incidents buried deep within the archives, the stories of students who had suffered and disappeared. Through it all, Elara spoke, voice rising and falling like a witness testifying before the world. "The threads we pull now don't end with expulsion or resignation. They must end with accountability, and with a new chapter for every student who walks through these doors." Then came Julia. The girl who had once humiliated Elara stood in the spotlight, brushing hair from a long faded scar at her temple. "I was part of the problem," Julia said, voice shaking, "but only because I was a symptom of it. We learned cruelty because cruelty was taught to us, and we refused to acknowledge the pain we caused because no one gave us a chance to break the cycle. Today, I stand to break it." Then came Mason, the boy with anger burning deep within. "I don't deserve forgiveness," he said quietly, brushing the microphone with shaking fingers. "But I am asking for a chance to make amends for every person I hurt, and for every person who felt too afraid to speak." In that room, the silence was sacred. Elara watched as students wiped away tears, as staff sank their heads into shaking hands, and as a few long-retired teachers embraced in the corner, weeping openly. In that room, in that moment, Fair Hill High felt like more than a school dot. Felt like a witness. That then came the verdict. The review panel announced its findings within a week. Gregory Holston was formally charged for abuse of authority, obstruction, and complicity. Several staff members were dismissed or placed under review. A new set of policies was announced to protect students, enforce accountability, and ensure every voice would be heard. And Fair Hill High announced its first ever initiative, the Elara Project, a fund and program dedicated to crisis intervention, restorative justice, and the empowerment of every student who felt unseen. Through it all, Elara felt herself shift from teacher to witness, witness to catalyst, and catalyst to a beacon. What started with a torn shirt and a secret camera had ended with a revolution, one that promised a new chapter for every person touched by cruelty. On the final day of the school year, Elara stood in the courtyard, brushing a hand down the smooth surface of the new plaque placed beside the old school sign. "Here, silence ends. Here, strength begins. Here, every voice matters." Students passed by, brushing hands across the plaque, as if to draw strength from it. Julia waved shyly from across the courtyard, a faint smile lighting her face. Mason offered a quiet nod, and Kyle, now in a rehabilitation program, had promised in a letter that one day, when he was ready, he would return to make amends. Alara sank down upon a nearby bench and watched as the afternoon sun bathed the courtyard in gold. The sting of betrayal still lingered, a faint scar upon her heart. But from that scar, a deeper truth emerged. The greatest strength doesn't come from silence or retaliation. It comes from standing firm when it hurts, from speaking out when it's hard, and from choosing to rise when it's easiest to fall. Through the whispers of the wind and the soft hum of voices in the courtyard, Alara smiled to herself. This chapter was closed. But the story of Fair Hill High, a story of survival, transformation, and belonging, had only just begun. The end.